The call came at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and I still remember exactly where I was standing, pressed against the bathroom wall of a stranger's apartment, one hand over my mouth, the other gripping my phone so hard my knuckles went white. "Where are you?" His voice came through the line, low and even. Not panicked, just focused in that way that always made my chest do something complicated. My voice broke. I tried again. "I'm at Kyle's place, my ex. He wouldn't let me leave." A pause. 2 seconds, maybe 3. "Text me the address." That was all he said. No questions, no why were you there or what were you thinking. Just text me the address, as if it were that simple, as if he weren't the most dangerous man I'd ever worked for, and I hadn't just called him at midnight from a locked bathroom because I genuinely had no one else. I should back up. My name is Brooke, and 18 months ago, I was the kind of woman who thought she had everything figured out. Good job, decent apartment on the north side, a boyfriend who wore nice shoes and always knew the right restaurant. I was 28, which felt both very young and like I was running out of time for reasons I couldn't explain. I worked as an executive assistant at a private equity firm downtown, which mostly meant I scheduled things and anticipated needs before people knew they had them. I was very good at it. I was good at it because I grew up in a house where reading the room wasn't optional. My boss was a man named Garrett Voss. If you've spent any time in certain circles in this city, you know the name. If you haven't, here's what you need to know. He was 41, built like someone who'd never stopped playing the sport he'd lettered in at 18, and he ran the kind of firm that didn't advertise but didn't need to. Old money that had learned new tricks. The kind of power that didn't announce itself because it didn't have to. There were rumors, of course. There are always rumors about men like him. I'd heard them before I ever walked into that office, and filed most of them under probably exaggerated. In 2 years of working for him, I had never once seen him raise his voice. Kyle was the opposite of that. I'd been with Kyle for 3 years, which is long enough to stop noticing the way someone flinches when you say something wrong, long enough to call it his personality instead of what it actually was. He had a temper that lived just below the surface, always present, always possible. He'd never hit me. I want to be clear about that, but there are 100 ways to make someone feel small that don't leave marks. He was fluent in all of them. He also had money, which I think I confused with security for a long time. His family was old Texas oil, transplanted north, and he had that easy confidence that comes from never having worried about anything structural. I didn't come from that. I came from a family where the heat got shut off twice before I turned 12, and somewhere in my adult brain, I'd made an equation that didn't hold. Money equals safe. I started noticing the cracks around year 2. The way he'd check my phone when he thought I was asleep. The dinners where he'd decide halfway through that I was embarrassing him and spend the rest of the night talking to everyone but me. Once, when I got a promotion and came home excited, genuinely excited, he listened for about 40 seconds before turning the conversation to something he'd accomplished that week. I thought it was an off night. Then it happened again, and again, until I understood that my good news made him uncomfortable in a way he'd never examine out loud. I should have left, I know that. The times I told myself I should have, I lost count. But leaving is not the clean, logical thing it looks like from the outside, especially when someone has spent years making you doubt your own judgment. You start running every decision through their filter before you even consciously make it. You forget what your actual instincts feel like. I started working for Mr. Voss 8 months before I ended things with Kyle. And I tell you that because those 8 months overlap in ways I didn't understand at the time. My first week, I knocked over a full cup of coffee across his desk and managed to ruin 2 files that were not, thankfully, originals. I stood there with paper towels in my hands, waiting to be fired or screamed at, and he just looked at me and said, "The bottom drawer on the right has a backup printer. Run copies of those 2 and get the cleaning service up here for the carpet." Then he went back to his call. I stood in the hallway afterward feeling like I'd misread a social cue so badly I might be losing my mind. Over the next few months, I learned his rhythms. He was exact without being rigid. He didn't explain himself often, but when he did, it was worth paying attention to. He had a way of seeing the thing underneath the thing, whatever was actually driving a situation, that I found both unsettling and deeply impressive. His world had edges I understood I wasn't fully seeing. There were meetings I didn't schedule and calls that came in on a separate line. Men who weren't on any org chart who deferred to him entirely. I wasn't naive. I had a general shape of what that probably meant, and I filed it carefully and didn't ask questions. What surprised me was the other side of him. He remembered that I took my coffee with oat milk before I told him, because he'd noticed the carton in the break room fridge with my name on it. He had a copy of Housekeeping on his shelf, which is not a book you expect, and when I mentioned it once, we ended up talking for 20 minutes about Marilyn Robinson. He'd had the same assistant for 11 years before she retired, and he'd thrown her a party that I heard from 3 different people was genuinely moving. He was not soft. I want to be precise about this. He was not warm in the way that people use that word to mean available or easy. But there was something underneath the precision, some quality of attention, that made you feel, when you were in the room with him, that you were being taken seriously. I left Kyle in March. It wasn't dramatic. That's the thing nobody tells you about leaving a relationship like that. Sometimes it's just quiet. We'd had a fight about something I can't even remember now, and I was sitting on the edge of the bathtub at 1 a.m, and I thought, I am 30 years older in this relationship than I should be. I thought, I cannot do this for another year. And then I thought, I cannot do this for another month. I moved into a studio on the east side with a window that looked at a brick wall, and I was happier than I'd been in 2 years. That should tell you everything. Kyle, predictably, did not take it well. The first month was calls, which I stopped answering. Then texts, which I stopped reading. Then he started showing up. Outside my office building twice. Outside a restaurant where I was having dinner with a friend. I told myself it would stop. That's what you tell yourself, because the alternative is understanding that something has shifted in a way you can't put back. It did not stop. By May, he had started leaving things at my door. Notes that were apologetic, and then notes that weren't. My building manager, a sweet older man named Don, told me Kyle had asked him what time I usually got home. Don hadn't told him, but the fact of the question sat in my stomach for 3 days. I was in the middle of dealing with all of this quietly, on my own, not telling anyone, when the Tuesday night happened. He called me at 7 that evening from a number I didn't recognize. He'd gotten a new phone, and his voice was the version I'd learned to be careful around. Too smooth. Like he'd been thinking about what he wanted to say for a long time. He wanted to talk. Just talk. He knew I was still upset. He understood that. He just wanted 20 minutes. I said no. He said he was outside my building. I said I was calling the police. He said if I did that, he would tell people at my firm things about my personal life that weren't true, but that would be hard to undo. He had a name and a face in this city. He played golf with the kind of men who made decisions about things. He said this, the way someone says a fact, not a threat, which, I've come to understand, is how people with a certain amount of power threaten you. I went downstairs. I don't know why. Partly because I was scared, and fear does not always produce the logical response. Partly because some part of me still believed if I could just explain myself clearly enough, he would understand and stop. He did not understand. He drove me to his place under the pretense of a conversation, and then, when I said I was leaving, he took my keys and my phone, and put them in his jacket pocket, and told me we weren't done. I was there for 4 hours. He didn't hurt me. He was too careful for that, or too aware of consequences. But he stood between me and the door, and every time I reached the point of saying, I am leaving right now, something in his voice would shift just enough to keep me calculating. That's control. That's what it actually looks like. Not a fist, but a constant low-grade uncertainty about what happens if you push. Around 11:30, he fell asleep on the couch. I think he thought he'd exhausted me into compliance. I found my keys in his jacket. My phone was dead. He'd had it face down on the counter, and I couldn't tell if he'd done something to it, or the battery had just run out. I found a charger in the kitchen, the same brand I used, and I stood in his bathroom with the door locked and the water running, watching my phone charge to 6%. I had my sister's number memorized. She lives in Phoenix. She could not get here in time to do anything. I had my friend Dana's number. I'd been leaning on Dana a lot lately, and I was ashamed of being here, in this bathroom, in this situation, and I didn't want to add to it. And then I thought about Mr. Voss. I don't know exactly why. Maybe it was the shape of his power versus Kyle's. Kyle's power was the kind that needed you to be smaller to exist. Mr. Voss's was the kind that didn't need anything from you at all, which paradoxically made it less threatening to be near. Maybe it was something more basic than that. Maybe it was just that I trusted him, in the practical, specific way you trust someone who has never once given you a reason not to. I called him. It rang twice. "Where are you?" he said, and his voice was so steady that something in my chest loosened just slightly. I told him. He told me to text the address and stay where I was and keep the door locked. 17 minutes later, I heard a knock at the apartment door. Then voices, Kyle's, disoriented and defensive, and another one, lower, that I couldn't fully make out. Then a long silence, then a single knock on the bathroom door. "Brooke," his voice. "You can come out." I unlocked the door. He was standing in the hallway. Kyle was not. The front door of the apartment was open, and I could see two men I didn't recognize standing in the corridor. He looked at me for a moment in that particular way he had, taking stock, precise. And then he said, "Do you have your things?" I had my phone and my keys. That was it. "That's fine," he said, like I'd answered out loud. "Come on." In the car, he didn't ask me to explain. He didn't ask me anything. He drove, and I sat in the passenger seat watching the city move past the window, and at some point I started crying silently, in that awful way where you're not even sure you're doing it until your face is wet. He put a box of tissues on my armrest. He kept driving. When we got to my building, he walked me to my door. I turned to say something. Thank you, probably, which felt so insufficient it was almost funny. "Get some sleep," he said. "Come in at 10 tomorrow, not 8. That was it. I didn't sleep. I lay in my bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about the particular feeling of being in that bathroom, the way time had moved strangely in there, and then the way his voice had sounded on the phone. Not "are you okay?" Not "what happened?" Just "where are you?" As if the only relevant question was the one with an actionable answer. I thought about that for a long time. The next 3 weeks were quiet in a way that required effort to maintain. I filed a police report, which felt both necessary and somehow absurd, like closing a barn door that had already been open too long. I got a new phone number. I talked to HR at my firm, which was uncomfortable in the specific way that any conversation is uncomfortable when it requires you to say out loud. I let someone do this to me. Kyle didn't contact me again. I don't know exactly what Mr. Voss said to him in that apartment, and I made a deliberate choice not to ask. I understood there were mechanisms in his world that I didn't fully see and probably shouldn't. What I knew was that it's stopped, and I let myself be grateful for that without pulling the thread further. At the office, things were the same. Exactly the same, which I found almost disorienting. He didn't treat me differently. He didn't mention it. When I brought him his coffee and a draft of a contract he needed to review on the Thursday after, he took both and said, "The margin on page 4 is off. The printer in conference room B has been miscalibrated. Use the one in the east corridor." As if that Tuesday night were something that existed in a separate file. I'm not sure if I appreciated that or found it maddening. Probably both. The shift was gradual and mostly internal. I started paying attention to things I'd been aware of, but not quite cataloging. The fact that when I laughed at something genuinely, not the professional version, the real one, he'd glance up from whatever he was reading. The fact that he'd started leaving articles on my desk, physical printouts, with no note but always things I'd find interesting. A profile of a woman who'd built a land conservation trust in Montana. A piece about the acoustics of old opera houses. He didn't reference them afterward. He just left them. Once I stayed very late to finish a filing before a deadline, and he came back from a dinner I'd scheduled earlier than I expected, and he stood in the doorway to my office for a moment before he said, "You should have sent that to the night team." I said I'd wanted to finish it myself. He was quiet for a second, and then he said, "I know." And then, "Have you eaten?" I said I'd had something earlier. He said, "I'll have them send something up from downstairs. Don't argue with me about it, Brooke." It was the first time he'd used my first name at work in 2 years. I didn't argue with him. The food came up from the restaurant on the building's ground floor, 2 courses, with a note from the kitchen that said compliments of Mr. Voss, and I sat at my desk and ate, and felt something in my chest do a slow, careful turn. I want to tell this part honestly, which means I have to say that I was not in a simple or uncomplicated place emotionally at that point. I had just gotten out of a relationship that had, over 3 years, done a fair amount of damage to my sense of what I deserved and what was normal. The last thing I trusted was my own read on a situation involving a man. I knew that. I was aware of it the way you're aware of an injury that's still healing, present, relevant, requiring accommodation. So when I noticed the feelings forming, I didn't act on them. I didn't lean in. I kept my professionalism exactly where it had always been, showed up exactly as I always had, and I let whatever was or wasn't there just sit quietly and wait. I think that was the right choice. I think it was also one of the hardest things I've done. What I didn't account for was him. About 2 months after the Tuesday night, he came into my office at the end of a day and leaned against the doorframe with his hands in his pockets. It was a posture I'd never seen from him before, less formal, like he'd made a decision to set something down. "I want to ask you something," he said. I waited. "Are you seeing anyone?" The question was so direct, I almost laughed. I said no. He nodded, like he was filing that somewhere. "I'm going to a dinner Saturday, a small one, at Whitmore's house. I'd like you to come with me." Not as my assistant. Whitmore was a collector he sometimes dealt with. I'd scheduled 3 meetings with his office in the past year. It was a name in a certain world. I looked at him for a long moment. "You're not asking me as my employer," I said. "No." "Then I need to think about it." Something crossed his face, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one, like I'd done something that confirmed a thing he'd already suspected. "Fair enough," he said, and he left. I thought about it for 4 days. I talked to Dana, who said, "Are you kidding me, Brooke?" in a tone that was not clarifying but was emotionally supportive. I talked to my sister, who said, "What does your gut say?" And I thought, my gut has been compromised equipment for the past few years, and I'm not sure how much I should trust it. But here's what I came back to, again and again. 2 years of watching him. The coffee I hadn't told him about, the books on his shelf, the food he'd sent up without making it into something. The 17 minutes. There are men who give you things to obligate you, and there are men who give you things and disappear before you can thank them, because the giving wasn't about you owing them anything. I called him on Friday and said I'd go. The dinner was small, 8 people, in a townhouse in a neighborhood I'd always admired from cabs. Whitmore turned out to be 70-something and deeply funny, with a wife who'd spent 20 years as a federal judge and had opinions about everything. I sat next to a woman who restored furniture and spent an hour telling me things about wood grain I found genuinely fascinating. Garrett, and it was Garrett by then, not Mr. Voss, which he'd asked for in the car on the way over, sat across the table from me most of the evening. Once, when I said something that made the table laugh, he caught my eye with an expression I can only describe as privately satisfied, like he'd known that would happen. On the way home, he asked what I'd thought of the restorationist. I said she was wonderful and I wished I'd had more time to talk to her. He said, "She's going to be consulting on a building acquisition we're looking at. I'll make sure you two overlap again." He said it like it was a practical matter, but it wasn't, not entirely, and we both knew that. He walked me to my door again. Different building now. I'd moved to a better place 6 weeks after everything with Kyle, because I'd decided I was done organizing my life around someone else's proximity. At the door, he stood there a moment. "Same time next Saturday?" he said. I said, "What's next Saturday?" He said, "I'll figure something out." He did. He figured something out every week for the next 4 months. Dinners, an exhibit at a gallery he'd been waiting to open, a drive up to Connecticut one Sunday to look at a property that I later understood was purely a pretext to spend 4 hours in a car talking. He was deliberate. That's the word I keep coming back to. Every step was deliberate, in the way that a careful person is careful. Not because they're withholding, but because they understand that some things break if you go too fast. He called me Birdie sometimes, which started as a reference to something I'd said once about a bird that had flown into the office window, and I'd spent 20 minutes trying to make sure it was okay. It was the kind of nickname you can't plan. It just landed, and then it stayed. I waited for the thing I'd learned to wait for with Kyle. The shift, the moment when the good version receded and something else came through. I kept a small, honest inventory. I paid attention. It never came. What came instead was this. A Sunday morning in November when we were in his kitchen and he was making coffee, actually making it, not having someone else make it. And he asked me what I was thinking about. It was a small question, the most ordinary question. and I realized I had an actual answer, a real one, and I said it out loud without calculating how it would land, and he just listened, and then said something back that was real in the same way. I thought, this is what it's supposed to feel like, not the big moments. We were at dinner in January, a Tuesday. I have a complicated relationship with Tuesdays, but this one was good, and we were toward the end of a bottle of wine, and he said, very quietly, I've been thinking about this for longer than I should probably admit. I asked how long. He said, you knocked a full cup of coffee across my desk your first week. I stared at him. That was before you'd barely spoken to me. You stood there waiting to be fired, he said, and you looked like you were calculating the structural integrity of every bad outcome and working out exactly how to handle each one. He paused. I thought, she knows how to think. That was the beginning of it. I sat with that for a moment. That is a very strange thing to fall for someone over, I said. Yes, he agreed. It is. He reached across the table and put his hand over mine, and I looked at his hand. The one I'd watched sign contracts, close deals, set down 2 courses of food on my desk and walk away before I could say thank you. And I thought about the bathroom wall and the 6% battery and the 17 minutes. I thought about Kyle, who had needed me smaller in order to feel bigger. I thought about the difference between a man who gives you his hand and waits, and a man who takes your keys and stands in front of the door. Okay, I said. He looked at me. I mean, yes, I said. 2. Whatever this is, whatever we're doing, yes. He turned my hand over in his and held it, and he had the expression of someone who had been patient for a long time and was not surprised by the outcome, but was quietly, genuinely glad. Good, he said. That was 8 months ago. We are still figuring out the shape of it, as people do. I went back to being his assistant for exactly 3 weeks after that dinner, before we both agreed that was not a functional arrangement, for reasons neither of us needed to enumerate. I now work on the acquisition side of a firm I'd admired for years, which he had nothing to do with except one call he made without telling me, which I found out about later and which we argued about, and which he conceded on gracefully, in that way of his. So I'm still in therapy. I want to say that plainly because I think people leave that part out. The Tuesday night didn't end in that bathroom, not really. It ended in a lot of conversations where I sat across from someone and said things out loud that I'd been carrying too quietly for too long. The healing wasn't Garrett. The healing was mine. He just gave me enough stability and enough room to do it properly. But I think about something, my therapist said once. Some people make the wound, and some people make the space for it to close. I think about the difference between those two things. I think about how long I confused them. Kyle is in Austin now. I know this because mutual acquaintances mention it occasionally, and I file the information without giving it much weight. Whatever Mr. Voss said to him that Tuesday night, I don't know. I've made peace with not knowing. What I know is the 17 minutes. What I know is text me the address. What I know is that sometimes the most important question isn't the most elaborate one. Sometimes it's just, where are you? And sometimes the answer is, here, finally. I'm right here.